The day everything broke. The black dress was still on my body when they told me. I had not even taken off my shoes. My feet ached from standing at the graveside for 2 hours. My hands still smelled faintly of the white roses I had placed on my husband's coffin. My eyes were dry not because I wasn't grieving, but because I had cried every single night for the 3 weeks Daniel spent in that hospital bed. And by the morning of his funeral, I think my body had simply run out of tears. I was 34 years old. I had just buried the man I loved. And I thought I genuinely believed that the hardest part of that day was already behind me. I was wrong. I walked through the front door of our home at 2:30 in the afternoon. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel's sister had offered to come in and sit with me, but I had said no. I needed silence. I needed to be in the space where he had lived, where his coffee cup was still sitting on the counter because I couldn't bring myself to wash it, where his jacket still hung on the hook by the door. I set my bag down on the kitchen table. I filled a glass of water. I stood at the window and looked out at the garden he had planted the summer before the roses he was so proud of, the small wooden bench he had built with his own hands on a Saturday afternoon while I watched and laughed at how seriously he was taking the measurements. And then my phone rang. The name on the screen was my father-in-law's personal attorney, a man named Gerald Holt. I had met him twice, once at our wedding, once at a dinner at Daniel's parents' house 2 years ago. A quiet man, careful with his words, not the kind of person who called without a reason. I answered. He said, "Mrs. Claire Ashworth, I'm very sorry for your loss. I need you to know that I am calling you directly because I believe you deserve to hear this from someone who is on your side." I sat down slowly in the kitchen chair. He continued. "It has come to my attention that earlier today this morning, before the funeral service, a transfer of ownership document was signed for Ashworth Building Solutions, the company your husband built. The signature on the transfer belongs to your father-in-law, Robert Ashworth. The company has been moved into a holding entity controlled by Robert and your mother-in-law, Patricia." The glass of water was still in my hand. I remember staring at it. I said, "I'm sorry, say that again." He said it again, slower this time, every word landing like a stone dropped into still water. My husband's company, the business Daniel had started from nothing at the age of 26, the business he had poured 11 years of his life into, the business that employed 42 people, that had grown from a 2-man operation in a rented garage to a firm with 3 offices and contracts worth millions. The business that was supposed to provide for our future, for the children we had talked about having, for the life we had planned together. That business had been signed away this morning, while Daniel's body was being lowered into the ground, while I was standing at his graveside holding white roses and saying goodbye to the man I had loved for 10 years. His parents had been at that funeral. I had stood next to them. Patricia had held my arm during the service. She had cried. I had believed those tears were real. They were not real. I sat in that kitchen chair for a long time after Gerald Holt finished speaking. He told me not to do anything hasty. He told me he had the documents. He told me he had been Daniel's personal attorney for 6 years and that Daniel had trusted him. And that Daniel, as it turned out, had been quietly preparing for exactly this situation. But I didn't hear that last part clearly. Not yet. What I heard was the sound of 11 years of my husband's work being taken. What I felt was a cold, settling fury, the kind that doesn't burn hot and wild, but instead sinks deep and stays. I thought about Patricia holding my arm at the graveside. I thought about Robert shaking the hands of Daniel's employees and accepting their condolences with a straight face. And I made myself a quiet promise right there in that kitchen in my black dress, with my husband's coffee cup still unwashed on the counter beside me. I was going to get it back, every single piece of it, and they would never see me coming. Pause. Let the silence sit for 2 full seconds before continuing. The man they never respected. To understand what happened that day, you need to understand Daniel. And to understand Daniel, you need to understand where he came from and what his family thought of him. Daniel James Ashworth was the second son of Robert and Patricia Ashworth. Robert had made his money in commercial property. Old money, carefully managed, never discussed openly but always present in the house they lived in, the school Daniel attended, the way Patricia spoke to waiters at restaurants. Daniel's older brother Marcus was the favourite. Everyone knew it. Marcus had gone into law. He wore the right suits and said the right things at the right dinners and smiled the way people smile when they know they are being watched and want to be admired.
Robert talked about Marcus the way some fathers talk about a trophy on a shelf, often, loudly, to anyone who would listen. Daniel was different. He was quiet. He was practical. He had a gift for building things not just physically, though he was extraordinary with his hands, but conceptually. He could look at a broken system and see how to fix it. He could walk into a failing project and quietly restructure it until it worked. He didn't need to be the loudest person in the room. He just needed to be the most useful one. When Daniel told his father at the age of 25 that he wanted to start his own construction and project management company, Robert laughed, not cruelly, or at least not with cruelty he was willing to show openly. He laughed the way people laugh when they have already decided something is foolish and are not interested in being corrected. He said, "You don't have the temperament for business, Daniel. You're too soft." Patricia said nothing. Patricia rarely said anything when Robert was speaking. But she watched Daniel with that particular expression. She had a slight tightening around the eyes, a careful flatness that I came to recognize over the years as her version of agreement. Daniel heard what his father said. He nodded politely. And then he went home and spent the next 3 months building his business plan at the kitchen table of his small flat, working until 2 or 3 in the morning, surviving on instant coffee and the quiet conviction that he knew something his father didn't. I met Daniel a year into that process. We were introduced at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was 31, I was 30. He was distracted that evening. He apologized twice for checking his phone, explaining that he was waiting on a contract decision that would determine whether his company survived its first year. I found that honesty so refreshing that I agreed to have dinner with him the following week. On our third date, the contract came through. He was so happy that he could barely sit still. He ordered a bottle of wine that was slightly too expensive for where we were financially at that point. And when I raised an eyebrow at the price, he said, "I know, but some things deserve to be marked properly." I fell in love with him that evening, not because of the wine, because of the way he said that. Some things deserve to be marked properly. He believed that. He lived that. He built his company on that principle that the quality of the work mattered, that the people who did the work mattered, that corners were not there to be cut. By the time we married 4 years later, Ashworth Building Solutions had 14 employees and a growing reputation for delivering complex projects on time and under budget. Daniel's father had stopped laughing by then. He had started making quiet comments at family dinners about perhaps Robert's property portfolio and Daniel's construction firm finding some mutual benefit, a merger perhaps, or at least a working relationship. Daniel had smiled politely and said he'd think about it. He never pursued it. I asked him once why, and he said, "Because the moment I let my father into my business, it stops being mine." That was 3 years before Daniel got sick. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in March. We were sitting in a doctor's office, and the word the doctor used was aggressive. I held Daniel's hand and I felt him go completely still beside me, not with fear, I understood later, but with the particular stillness of a man who is already calculating, already planning, already thinking 3 steps ahead. On the drive home, he said very little, but that evening after dinner, he called Gerald Holt and made an appointment for the following week. He didn't tell me why. Not then. I understand now. He had seen what was coming. Not death. He was not ready to accept that yet, but trouble. The kind of trouble that arrives wearing a familiar face. He had spent 11 years building something real, and he was not going to let it be taken. While I was saying goodbye, the 3 weeks Daniel spent in the hospital at the end were the longest weeks of my life. I was there every day. I left only to shower, to sleep for a few hours, to handle the things that had to be handled, the calls to the business, the conversations with Daniel's operations manager, a good man named Thomas, who was holding everything together with remarkable steadiness while his employer lay in a hospital bed. Robert and Patricia came to the hospital. They came several times in the first week, less often after that. I noticed the gap but said nothing. Daniel was the one who mattered. Everything else could wait. On the last evening, Daniel and I were alone. He was tired in a way that went beyond the body, a deep cellular exhaustion that I had no words for. But his mind was clear, his eyes were clear. He held my hand and talked about things we had done together. The holiday we took to Portugal the year after we married, where we got completely lost in a small village and ended up eating the best meal of our lives in a restaurant we found by accident. The afternoon he tried to teach me to play chess and gave up after 40 minutes because I kept asking whether the rules could be different. He did not talk about the business. He did not talk about his parents. He talked about us. At one point he said, "I need you to trust Gerald. Whatever happens, trust Gerald." I told him I would. He died at 4 in the morning, quietly, the way he did most things. The funeral was held 9 days later. I organised it myself,
not because there was no one to help, but because it felt like something I needed to do. The flowers, the music, the order of service. Each choice was a way of saying, one last time, this is who he was, this is how much he mattered. Robert and Patricia were present throughout the planning. They offered opinions. I listened to some and redirected others. We were, on the surface, a grieving family working together. Patricia helped me choose the reading. Robert approved the guest list. What I did not know, what I could not have imagined, even knowing what I knew about them, was that on the morning of the funeral, before the service began, Robert Ashworth had driven to the offices of a solicitor he had engaged privately and signed a document transferring control of Ashworth Building Solutions into a holding company called Ashworth Family Assets Limited. The document cited a clause in the original company incorporation, a clause that Daniel had apparently never revisited, a small line of legal language that gave a co-signing director the right to initiate a transfer in certain circumstances. Robert had been listed as a co-director in the earliest days of the company when Daniel had needed a named director to satisfy a bank lending requirement. That arrangement had been intended as temporary. It had never been formally dissolved. Robert had found that clause. He had found it, built a case around it, engaged a solicitor to execute it quietly, and chosen the morning of his son's funeral to sign it. While I was standing at the graveside, Patricia's arm through mine, her head bowed, tears on her face. Her husband was across the city, signing his dead son's company away. I did not know any of this during the service. I stood and grieved and held myself together with everything I had. I shook hands and accepted condolences and watched Daniel's coffin and thought of Portugal, of chess, of a wooden bench in a garden, of the way he said some things deserved to be marked properly. And then I went home, and Gerald Holt called, and the world rearranged itself into something I did not recognise. Later, much later, after everything that followed, I would ask myself whether I was surprised, whether some part of me had seen this coming. The honest answer is no. I had known Robert and Patricia were difficult. I had known they resented the independence Daniel had built. I had known they had never fully accepted me, the woman from an ordinary family who had married their son, and in their view, pulled him further from the orbit they wanted him in. But to do this on the day of his funeral, to use the morning of his burial as cover, that was not difficult, that was not resentful, that was a particular kind of cold that I had no name for. I found a name for it later. Gerald gave it a legal name. A judge would eventually give it another name entirely. But that evening, sitting in my kitchen in my black dress, I just called it what it was. A theft from the man they claimed to love, carried out on the day they pretended to grieve him. It would not stand. What Daniel already knew. I met Gerald Holt in his office 2 days after the funeral. I had not slept well. I was running on tea and the particular focused energy that comes when grief turns into something useful, when the sadness finds a direction and becomes something harder and quieter and more purposeful. Gerald's office was on the 4th floor of a building in the city centre. He was a man in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of measured manner that made you feel every word he said had been considered before he released it. He poured me coffee and sat across the table and looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as careful respect. He said, "Before I show you what Daniel prepared, I want to say something. He thought about this for a long time. He didn't do it with anger. He did it with love, specifically love for you and for the people who worked in that company. He knew his father. He had known him his whole life." I said, "Show me." Gerald opened a folder. What Daniel had done, quietly, methodically, over the final 18 months of his illness, was extraordinary. He had not been able to dissolve his father's directorship entirely without triggering questions he wasn't ready to answer within the family. But he had done something smarter. He had restructured the company's core assets, the intellectual property, the project management systems Daniel had built over 11 years, the proprietary tendering software his team had developed, the client contracts and the ongoing project files had been placed into a separate limited company, a company called DJA Operations Limited, DJA, Daniel James Ashworth. That company had one shareholder and one director, me. Gerald had witnessed the transfer documents. They were dated 14 months earlier. They were completely clean. They had been filed correctly with Companies House. There was nothing Robert's solicitor could challenge because there was nothing irregular to find. The company Robert had seized, Ashworth Building Solutions, still existed, but without the systems, the contracts, the project files and the client relationships that Daniel had quietly moved into DJA operations, it was essentially a shell, a name, a registered address, a set of accounts that showed revenue history but controlled no ongoing work. Robert had stolen an empty box. He didn't know it yet. Gerald also showed me a second document, a letter handwritten from Daniel, addressed to me. Gerald had been instructed to deliver it in person, in this meeting, and to stay in the room while I read it. I will not share everything Daniel wrote in that letter. Some of it belongs only to me. But I will tell you this, he apologized for not telling me sooner. He said he hadn't wanted me to carry the weight of knowing while he was still alive, while we were still fighting for time together. He said he had wanted our last months to be about us, not about his parents, not about the business, not about the ugliness he knew was coming. He said he trusted me completely. He said he knew I would handle it. And then, at the bottom of the letter, in his handwriting, careful and slightly uneven from the medication, he wrote a single line that I have kept with me every day since. He wrote, "The company was always yours as much as mine. Don't let them forget that." I folded the letter and put it in my bag. I looked at Gerald and said, "What do we do first?" He smiled, just slightly, the smile of a man who had been waiting for exactly that question. We started with a letter, formal, legal, sent by recorded delivery to Robert Ashworth's home address and to the solicitor he had engaged. The letter set out, clearly and without drama, the existence of DJA Operations Limited. It outlined the transfer of assets. It noted the dates of registration. It included certified copies of the company's house filings. It invited Robert to respond within 14 days. It was signed by Gerald on my behalf. While we waited, Gerald filed a formal complaint with the Solicitors Regulation Authority regarding the conduct of the solicitor Robert had engaged, specifically the question of whether that solicitor had been fully informed of the circumstances under which the co-directorship clause was being activated, and whether the timing of the transfer raised questions that required investigation. We also called Thomas, the operations manager. I told him what had happened. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, "Claire, every single person in this building would walk out tomorrow if you asked them to." I said, "I'm not going to ask you to do that. I'm going to ask you to stay exactly where you are and keep doing your jobs. Can you do that?" He said, "Already done." 14 days passed. Robert did not respond. So we moved to the next step. The climax, resolution and moral. The morning the room went quiet. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October. It was not a criminal court. It was a civil hearing, a request for a judicial declaration regarding the validity of the asset transfer and the question of whether Robert Ashworth's use of the co-directorship clause constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. Gerald had explained the legal architecture to me carefully and more than once because I wanted to understand every piece of it. I did not want to be a passenger in this process. Daniel had trusted me to handle it, and I intended to understand exactly what I was handling. I wore dark blue, not black. I had made a decision, somewhere in the weeks of preparation, that I was done wearing black. Black was for grief. This was something else. Robert and Patricia arrived with their solicitor and a barrister they had engaged when it became clear this was not going to go away quietly. Robert was wearing a grey suit. He looked older than I remembered from the funeral, harder around the jaw, less certain in the eyes. Patricia walked slightly behind him, as she always did. She did not look at me when they entered the room. Marcus was also present. He sat beside his parents in his lawyer's suit, with his lawyer's face, carefully neutral, carefully composed. He had called me twice in the weeks before the hearing, both times with some version of the suggestion that this could all be resolved without the unpleasantness of a formal process. I had listened politely both times and said I would consider it. I had not considered it. The barrister Gerald had engaged was a woman named Diane Okafor. She was 47, composed, and precise in a way that reminded me, painfully, warmly, of Daniel. She had reviewed every document. She knew the case the way a surgeon knows the body they are about to operate on. She began by establishing the timeline, the original incorporation documents, the nature and purpose of Robert's co-directorship in the company's first year, the subsequent years in which that directorship had been functionally dormant, no meetings attended, no decisions signed, no correspondence, 11 years of inactivity, then the asset transfer into DJA operations, the dates, the filing records, the legal separation of the company's operational core from its registered shell, then the morning of the funeral, the timing, the document Robert had signed, the fact that his own son had been buried that day. Diane did not editorialize, she did not need to. The facts, laid out in sequence, were sufficient. Robert's barrister argued that the co-directorship clause was valid and had been exercised legitimately. He argued that Robert had acted to protect the Ashworth family's interests during a period of uncertainty following Daniel's death. He used words like reasonable and precautionary and good faith. Diane let him finish. Then she presented three things. First, an email chain recovered from Daniel's archived files between Robert and his privately engaged solicitor. The emails had been initiated not after Daniel's death, but 4 months before it, during Daniel's last hospitalization. In the emails, Robert had asked the solicitor to research the co-directorship clause and advise on the feasibility of activating it. 4 months before Daniel died, Robert had already been planning this. Second, a statement from Thomas and 6 other senior members of Ashworth Building Solutions staff confirming that the client relationships, ongoing contracts and project management systems had been moved to DJA operations with their full knowledge and cooperation, and confirming that Daniel had personally briefed them on the rationale for doing so. Third, a certified copy of Daniel's handwritten instruction to Gerald, dated the same day as the asset transfer to DJA operations, confirming his intention and authorising Gerald to act on my behalf in all matters relating to the company following his death. The room was quiet for a long time after Diane sat down. The judge, a man named Fairweather, with reading glasses and a manner of absolute unhurriedness, reviewed the documents at the pace he chose, which was slow and thorough, and the rest of us simply waited. Then he spoke. He said that the co-directorship clause had indeed been technically valid at the time of activation. He said he was not, in this hearing, in a position to make a finding of fraud. Those words, in that order, made Robert's barrister sit slightly straighter. But then Judge Fairweather continued. He said that the primary question before him was not the validity of the clause, but the question of what Ashworth Building Solutions, as seized, actually contained and controlled. And on that question, the answer was unambiguous. The company's operational assets, its contracts, its systems, its intellectual property, its client base had been legally transferred to DJA Operations Limited 14 months prior. That transfer was clean, properly filed, and entirely within Daniel Ashworth's rights as majority shareholder to execute. What Robert Ashworth now held, the judge said, was a registered company name, a set of historical accounts, and an empty structure. He declared DJA Operations Limited the legitimate vehicle of Ashworth Building Solutions' ongoing business. He confirmed my position as sole shareholder and director. He noted, with what I can only describe as judicial understatement, that the timing of Robert's actions on the morning of his son's funeral raised questions that other parties, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, whose investigation was already in progress, might wish to examine carefully. He awarded full legal costs against Robert Ashworth. The room was very quiet. I looked at Robert. He was staring at the table. Patricia had her hand pressed to her mouth. Marcus was looking at the ceiling. I felt, and I want to be honest about this because the feeling surprised me, I felt very little in that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly. I felt something closer to completion, like a door that had been left open for a long time had finally quietly closed. In the weeks that followed, I formally relaunched the business under a new name, one that honoured Daniel's initials but left behind the Ashworth name entirely, DJA Building Group. Thomas stayed on as operations director. Every member of staff who had been waiting stayed. The client contracts transferred cleanly because they had always been in DJA operations. Robert and Patricia did not reach out, not to apologise, not to negotiate, not to explain. The SRA investigation continued. I did not follow it closely. I had other things to focus on. I kept Daniel's coffee cup. I washed it eventually, one quiet morning about 6 months after the funeral, standing at the kitchen sink, watching the garden he had planted. The roses were blooming. The bench was still there, slightly weathered now, measurements still perfect. Some things deserved to be marked properly. I marked it. I marked all of it, not with anger in the end, though the anger had been real and it had been useful and I do not regret it. I marked it with work, with steadiness, with the particular dignity of a person who refuses to let someone else's cruelty define the story. Here is what I want to leave you with. What Robert Ashworth did that morning was not a business decision. It was a statement, one that said, you don't matter, your grief doesn't matter, the life Daniel built doesn't matter. We are taking it because we believe we can. What Daniel had done, quietly and carefully, over the 18 months before he died, was a counter-statement, one that said, I see you, I know you, and I have already made sure you cannot. The most powerful preparation is the kind that happens in silence, and the most devastating response is the kind that arrives not with shouting, not with rage, but with documents, with dates, with a folder placed on a table in a quiet room, in front of a judge who reads slowly and misses nothing. They thought they had taken everything. They hadn't touched a thing that mattered. Channel outro, spoken. If this story reached you, if you have ever stood in a room and felt invisible while someone helped themselves to what was yours, leave one word in the comments. Just one. We'll know what it means. Subscribe to Family Revenge Chronicles, because the people who were told to stay quiet, this is where they speak.